Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm Devyani Chaturvedi, Research Analyst at ISAS, and I will be your host for today's episode. On 1st February 2025, India's Finance Minister, Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman, presented the Union Budget. While last year's budget was shadowed by coalition politics, this budget seems to be very different. It has focused on stimulating weak consumer expenditure while also prioritizing capital expenditure to sustain the economy's growth at 6% or more. To understand the intricacies of the budget, joining me today is Mr. Vinod Rai, Distinguished Visiting Research Fellow at ISAS and former Comptroller and Auditor General of India. Welcome, Mr. Rai.
Thank you, Devyani. Thank you for getting me over.
Absolutely, it's always a pleasure. So, Mr. Rai, my first question is, how do you view this year's budget? Do you see any continuities between this budget in comparison to the previous budgets of this government?
Devyani, I must say that this is the first full budget of the Modi 3.0, as one would like to say. This is the third term of the Modi government. And of course, in the present term, there are a larger number of constituent units, which is alliance partners of the Bharatiya Janata Party. But to the credit of the government, it's a very clear budget that has been presented, very precise in its approach. And I think it does indicate some long term perspectives of what the government is going to be addressing. So, from a union budget perspective, the budget does a good job of balancing different needs. Firstly, it has stayed the course on fiscal consolidation, which had been committed by the previous governments. And this time it has consolidated the fist by about 40 basis points going into fiscal 26. The budget has uh, revised its deficit targets from 5% to 4.8%. And now it is proposing to revise it to 4.4%, which is below the targeted 4.5%. This is what I mentioned as demonstrates a commitment to fiscal consolidation. Now, separately, the budget has successfully met its objectives of stimulating consumption through tax cuts, increasing capital expenditure via state transfers, and stabilizing the fiscal deficit. These measures are expected to accelerate economic growth while ensuring macroeconomic stability. And there is a potential of pivoting both fiscal and monetary policies towards supporting growth to align with anticipation of a cyclical recovery in growth. And post the budget, today, the Reserve Bank's Monetary Policy Committee has also declared a 25 basis points reduction in the key rate, interest rate of the bank. Separately, I must also admit that the budget, as in the past, has gone its term in ensuring transparency in the budget documents and indicating each of the indicator terms very, very clearly. So, to that extent, I think it has been continuous in indicating whatever has been the parameters that a normal budget should be putting out in public domain.
Thank you, Mr. Rai, for that holistic perspective on what the possible continuities between this budget and the previous budgets were. Now, focusing a little on the differences, I would request you to elaborate upon the key differences that have emerged from this year's budget.
See, to arrest the decline in growth after the buoyant levels that we saw post COVID, measures beyond the budget need to be taken. And the economic survey has emphasized further deregulating of various sectors of the economy, which I think is a very healthy trend if it happens. And some of these areas fall within the domain of the state governments. So, an era of close center state coordination seems to be arising, and that will make making the next generation reforms very successful. And I hope that this healthy trend continues. Now, beyond that, to accelerate growth, measures will be necessary to encourage private sector investment, uplift household savings sentiment, and simultaneously encourage consumer spending. Thus, the fiscal expansion will have to be dovetailed with the monetary measures. And I think this is the first time that we have seen, and I will elaborate this further, that the acceleration in the economy is being progressed through providing greater disposable income in the hands of the public and holding back a little on the capital expenditure. And that's how I think this budget is different from other budgets, because this budget is also focusing much more on the middle income group, and that's why the tax rates have been modified.
Taking your point forward on the middle income group, one of the highlights of this, or one of the most discussed points, have actually been direct taxation. And taking that, trying to understand exactly how it works out, how realistic do you think are these governments' revenue expectations, especially given the unprecedented tax bonanza and the the introduction of a new taxation bill and the prospective tax reforms that would be coming up in the near future?
Yeah, see, that is a case in point, because that is a very debated issue which has arisen because of the budget announcements of the finance minister. The budget's basic calculations appear fairly realistic, and I would not have a quarrel with that. With nominal GDP being projected at about 10.1% for fiscal 2026 and gross tax revenue growth being at 10.8%. However, as you pointed out, there is need for vigilance regarding income tax collection growth, which the government expects to be about 14.4%. Now, this expectation comes in the wake of the income tax cuts and the execution of capex spending to meet targets. Now, why there is, I talked about vigilance on the income tax collection, is because there has been a consequent to the relaxation on the minimum income, there is going to be a narrowing of the tax base. So you will have a larger amount of tax attempted to be collecting from a lower tax base of tax paying individuals. And that's where I think the tax reforms come into place, where there will be, the government has announced that a new income tax code is likely to be brought forth in the this session itself, where it will bring about greater trust between the income tax and the tax-paying consumer. So, to that extent, we are hoping that the tax reforms that are being announced hopefully will ensure that tax collections become exactly what the government has projected, and to that extent, there will not be uh, revenue shortfalls.
Apart from revenue reforms, another major highlight or pointer in the budget has been the capital expenditure, especially increased investment in areas such as infrastructure. How well do you think this year's budget balances capital expenditure with fiscal discipline, especially keeping in mind the changes in revenue expectations as well?
See, capital expenditure last year, or fiscal 25, is seeing a slight shortfall. And the reason being attributed to this shortfall is the fact that we've had state elections, we've had the general election. Now, when an election is announced, normally the model code of conduct comes into play. So whether it's the state elections or the general election, there is a period in which capital expenditure has a slowdown. I mean, government expenditure on that front has a slowdown. To that extent, uh, capital expenditure was down, and in the current year, it is being projected, or rather in fiscal 26, it's being projected to be 11.21 crores as the budget estimate for 25-26, whereas the current year's budget estimates were 11.11 lakh crores to the budget in the budget data. So there has been a consequent slowdown, but depending upon the budget estimates for the current year or the revised estimates for the current year, there is a consequential 10% increase in the capital expenditure that the government has projected for next fiscal.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Rai. The income tax cuts and consumption incentives, as well as rural welfare schemes, all allude towards the government's efforts to boost weak demand in the economy. Would you agree? And how do you interpret these measures?
Yes, this is the issue which is again being debated a great deal because the increase in the exemption limit from rupees 7 lakhs to 12 lakhs is leading to a narrowing down of the tax base. We used to have, or rather, we have about 80 lakh taxpayers, and now that is going to be reduced to about only 30 lakh out of them actually pay the tax. So now what's going to happen is that the government is expecting that this 1 trillion rupees, which is likely to be the revenue loss because of this exemption limit being increased, will be passed on into the hands of the consumer as disposable income. Now, this disposable income, the government hopes and the government is planning, will have a multiplier of 5, which could generate additional consumption of roughly rupees 5 trillion. Uh, Now, the middle class today has a higher marginal propensity to consume than the marginal propensity to save. So the government's estimates that this additional 1 trillion rupees, which will be passed on to the hands of the consumer, will necessarily go into consumer spending, which in turn will generate additional incomes and additional economic activity. Now, this is a fairly optimistic kind of a projection. And there are people who believe that the marginal propensity to consume may not be as high as the government is estimating it to be. But I think it's a calculated gamble that the government has taken. And let us hope that it works out so that the economic activity, which had shown a slight slowdown, may increase due to increased spending from the middle class, in middle income class of people. So that extent, there is likely to be a certain degree of uncertainty, but hopefully the government will review this in the mid-year and see how economic activities actually being generated due to a cut in the tax rate.
Thank you so much, I think, for that response. That really helped me understand the logic behind this, and I'm sure it would be really helpful for our listeners as well. It gave me a very good understanding of both sides of the balance sheet and how somebody in the Indian government would kind of look at it. So I think one of the key areas, or actually some of the key areas in the budget that were highlighted in terms of support schemes included in areas such as agriculture, MSMEs. There was also a lot of talk of green energy and artificial intelligence and climate change efforts. So, how do you think the budget kind of prioritize these sectors? And do you think the focus was more on long term growth or rather on short term efforts, given that even our climate commitments have to be reached and we're part of certain international forums that kind of have a lot of politics involved that sort of pushes to meet these requirements?
See, the government is, and especially after India's presidency of G20, our government is committed to long term ensuring the growth and issues of sorry, climate financing and climate mitigation. But at the same time, finding climate finance is not going to be easy. To that extent, at least for the short term, the MSME empowerment by the government continues, and doubling the credit guarantee to MSMEs from rupees 50 million to rupees 100 million is expected to stimulate small business growth, job creation, and economic resilience. Because MSMEs continue to be a crucial engine of development as far as India is concerned, and they do take care of a large number of unregulated labor also. The budget proposes the credit card scheme for micro enterprises, customized with a rupees 5 lakh limit for those registered on the what is known as the Udyam portal, with plans to issue 10 lakh cards. So they are doubling it. Further, a new scheme has been suggested for first time entrepreneurs, particularly targeting women and scheduled caste and scheduled tribe entrepreneurs, offering them loans roughly up to rupees 20 million over the next 5 years. Beyond this sustainability and green economy, the emphasis has been on sustainable growth, which is very clear, with the budget earmarking funds for clean tech manufacturing and green initiatives, including a greenfield nuclear energy mission for advancing India's nuclear energy sector, and this would be in the private sector. The government is also focusing on long term solutions for agriculture, food security, and climate resilience, as I mentioned earlier, through gene banks and research in that sector. So as I mentioned earlier, while keeping its long term perspectives in view in terms of climate mitigation, climate effect mitigation, and artificial intelligence, government through this budget has taken small steps for the medium term achievement of these targets.
Absolutely. I think there have also been certain reforms in terms of custom taxes that have been introduced on critical minerals, all of which are efforts to contribute towards India's efforts towards climate transition and energy transition and energy security. So, thank you for helping us understand how these budgetary initiatives look at long-term growth and holistic sustainable development. My last question to you focuses on contextualizing the Indian budget and looking at how the global order is changing. So in recent times, the global order, as we know, has significantly changed, and with Trump's presidency and his energy initiatives and his pulling out of the WHO, as well as most likely his pulling out of the climate change negotiations as well, we are going to expect a lot of new shocks, especially in the energy market and towards climate transition. How do you think the budget accounts for such highly volatile global risks?
Yeah, this is an issue which I think uh, annual budget may not be able to factor in straight away, because global risk factors which are very difficult to fathom as at present. You are absolutely right in talking about energy issues, because the U.S. president has declared that they will be, going in for more indigenous production of petroleum from their sides, and the fact that they may withdraw from Paris Accord of 2009 imposes certain further uncertainties. But I guess these are geopolitical kind of risks that will have to be factored in from time to time. And much will depend on the Indian economy stabilizing the fundamentals of its, energy as well as foreign investments, deposits, direct investments, etc., to ensure its fundamentals are strong so that it is able to take on these risks which may arise in the very near future. So the budget will have to aid growth recovery through measures promoting consumption and increasing effective capital expenditure. I mean, this is, I believe, likely to result in a more broad based recovery, while continued consolidation should help maintain micro and macro stability. The simultaneous boost to consumption and capital expenditure should benefit for equities, internal domestic investment, and attracting investment from abroad also in the context of ongoing and better than expected fiscal consolidation. And the fact that the government has cut down or not increase capital expenditure from its side would mean that there would be crowding in of private investment in that sector. So I sincerely believe that if these fundamentals of the Indian economy are strong, we should be in a position to take on external geopolitical shocks that may arise or may not arise going forward.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rai, for your time and your insights on the Indian budget. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. You were listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, please visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates from our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter.